these leading questions and these near-death experience proponents try to make the story look like it happened when her brain was actually totally dead. There's no case of that ever happening. Obviously, a functioning brain can't even have a hallucination. I would ask Dinesh for evidence that that has ever happened. This composite picture that Raymond Moody came up with doesn't happen. What happens is that a few people who have near-death experiences have one little fragment of it here. Somebody might see a light here, somebody might go through a tunnel here, somebody might feel this feelings of peace. The most common thing reported is a feeling of peace that a lot of people have. But nobody has the full near-death experience. There are correlations now between certain medical states and certain reports of what they're happening in near-death experience. People under heart attacks tend to report this cluster of experiences, while people in accidents tend to report this cluster from the experiences. Nobody has the whole thing. Many of them are exaggerated stories. There are many cultural differences that just can't be explained away. It's not just that somebody sees Jesus and a Hindu sees Yamaraj. It's not just that they mistake it. These supposedly light beings are doing totally different functions. In India, most near-death experiences involve not going to some pastoral scene or some heavenly city. They go into this office, a clerical office, and then Yamaraj is up there with a pencil, filling out a ledger book, saying, oh, there must have been a clerical mistake here. We sent the wrong person. We're going to have to send you back. So obviously the functioning of this person is even different. Across cultures, in Thailand, it's Yamatuts who has their ideas. And so if it's the same person, why are they doing different things? This life review is very uncommon. The life review that happens during the near-death experience doesn't happen to many people, and usually it's totally random and stupid. They review certain sporadic things. Never does anyone report a complete, moral judgment life review of their life going before them. It's usually like, these scenes flash in my mind of, for no reason, this person that I didn't know. A lot of these people say their lives were changed, but they go back to living normal lives, doing menial work. And of course, if I was near death, my life would change. I would think, wow, I'm lucky to be alive. A near-death experience is a life-changing experience. Near-death experiences can be triggered by just thinking you are dying, by being afraid, by falling off a cliff thinking you're going to die, by having trauma. They can be triggered by drugs, certain clusters of these things. They can be triggered by sexual assault. They can be triggered by having an accident or an epileptic seizure, or the lobe is implicated in all of this. Yes, it is true that blind people report having near-death experience or out-of-body experiences, but what's interesting is that people who are congenitally blind from birth don't report colors. They report what their brain is hearing, and they reconstruct the scene, but no congenitally blind person who had an out-of-body experience reports seeing anything in color. Why not? Is the soul of a blind person unable to see in colors while everybody else's soul is? Clearly, this is evidence that points to a hallucination in the brain. There have been no evidences of any remote targets being seen, the blue shoe on the ledge notwithstanding. And we also have evidence that as these people are re-examined later, their reports grow over time. They get exaggerated over time. So it's not just that they see this light or this Jesus, but if you look at all these near-death experiences, children will see their pets. Children will see their stuffed animals. One guy saw Dracula. One person reported he had a near-death experience and he saw a video game character. So are we going to see the Mario Brothers in heaven someday? Dinesh, do you take these things seriously? Don't you agree that that's a hallucination? They see comic book characters, some of them. One person said she died and she saw Elvis Presley. He said, hey, how you doing? Because she had met him as a child, and so Elvis Presley welcomed her to heaven. Another saw Albert Einstein. One man died and he saw Jesus, or somebody that looked like Jesus, on a chariot coming up. Get on the chariot to come to heaven. That's a near-death experience. But the head was like a Jesus or Jesus' brother, but it was a centaur. It was a horse's legs and wings. And so is that what we're going to see? We're going to see a centaur taking us up into heaven? Some of them see their playmates. One woman died, but she didn't see heaven. She saw a Russian battlefield. Another woman in Guam died, and she was transported flying, and she was landing in Los Angeles because she wanted to be with her daughter who lived in the United States. That's what she saw. One person died, and there was a butterfly licking in its face, a butterfly in heaven, insects. One boy died and had I shouldn't say died, he had a near-death experience, and he had a conversation with a bumblebee, and the bumblebee said, are you hungry? And he said, yeah, I'm hungry. And so he fed, how can a soul be hungry in any event? So blue train rides and Draculas and Superman characters, and sure, there's some lights and there's some tunnels and there's some this and that, but The reports of the similarities of near-death experiences are grossly exaggerated and do not count as evidence for any life after death.
At this point, we'd like to welcome our speakers over to these comfortable chairs.
Dan, how many books have you read on near-death experiences?
I've read one complete book by
One
Susan
complete
Blackmore,
book, okay.
and I read Keith Augustine's exhaustive essay, including the couple dozen books that he read. And he reproduces, in his essay, he reproduces the stories, so you can read them indirectly.
So all this scorn on a topic of surpassing importance, the only empirical evidence that you say for life after death, in which there are literally hundreds of books and a Near-Death Studies Association and multiple scholarly researchers, you have read one book and one article.
That's right.
Okay.
But do you contest any of the facts?
Yes, I do. You said, for example, that there are no examples of people whose brainwaves have stopped and yet have had near-death experiences. So I take it you're not familiar with the study published, I believe last year or the year before, by the Dutch physician Pim van Lommel. This was in the Lancet, 350 patients. And he says it reports several near-death experiences that took place even after the patient's brain activity had completely ceased. You're not familiar with this study?
I read about that. Did you read the whole study?
I read the study.
Okay.
And the study does have specific cases of people who have shown no registered brain activity who are yet reporting experience. See, I think you're missing the point of all this. The point of all this is not to prove...
Well, let me ask you a question.
Well,
that was a good question.
You'll have your time.
But you were asking me questions.
I think I already established that you had read almost nothing on the subject.
But you were asking me a question.
Mr. Barker, you'll have your opportunity to ask him.
All right.
Yeah, but he was asking me a question I should respond to.
Let's move on, and you can take your
just
time.
for clarification, these people who were clinically brain dead were reporting that during that specific time when their brain was totally shut down, they were having perceptions of things that were happening during that moment, or that they later came back and gave perceptions of what happened during the entire process. What was the example? What did they see? In that study that you read, what was the specific example of what the person saw?
They saw tunnels, they saw bright lights, they had experiences of warmth, they saw celestial beings, they saw their whole life flash before them. In other words, I think what you're doing is...
That's beside the point.
It's not beside the point. The point is this. The point is, does consciousness survive when the material body stops? It has nothing to do with butterflies or this or that. You can have stupid experiences, but the fact that you have experience going on at all is the significance. It's not supposed to happen when the material body shuts down.
Okay, but to clarify here, the examples you just gave of these near-death experiences were not out-of-body veridical experiences of something we can test that happened in the operating room at that time. What we're looking for to have veridical evidence is for those minutes when the brain is actually considered non-functioning. During that time, did they observe or hear a conversation of something that they could not have known? Sure, after the experience, they're all going to report, because these tunnels and the lights and the feeling of peace happen at different stages during the dying process. So we're not talking about the dead brain, we're talking about the dying brain. And as they later come out of it, they're going to report what happened during that whole process. But that article that you read, what did it say that they verified veridically happened during that time when their brain was actually clinically dead? Did they observe something in the room or hear something they could not have known? Or are they just reporting lights and peace?
And I'm going to leave that for your question time. You talked about the resurrection as a legend. Let me ask you this. Do you believe that Socrates was a real person?
I think the probability of the existence of a historical Socrates is extremely high.
It's extremely high.
It's not 100%, but I would say
It's very likely that there was a Socrates.
Yes, based on a lot of corroborative reports, right?
Based on a lot of corroborative reports. And what are those corroborative reports?
Greek histories.
Greek histories. There are actually only three sources for Socrates. There's Plato, there is Aristophanes, and there's Xenophon. Right? Three guys who were, by the way, two of them were disciples of Socrates. And yet you, based on that, are very confident that Socrates was in fact real.
Well, he might not have been, but I think we have a high level of confidence. He might not have existed. They might have invented him, but in the absence of any evidence of legendary embellishment and such, I think his story pretty much fits the historical model of what we would consider acceptable. Like, we don't know if Homer existed, for example. We don't really know that.
Now you're making some very excellent points. You're basically saying that even though we don't have a single word that Socrates wrote, right? Socrates never wrote a word. His words are reconstructed by Plato. On the basis of the fact that Plato is a believable guy, even though he admired Socrates and clearly wanted to puff him up, you believe, you have pretty good confidence, and in fact there's probably not a philosopher in the room or in America alive who doesn't believe that there was a Socrates. For Jesus, we have much greater evidence, multiple sources, Greek sources, Roman sources, Jewish sources, and the disciples, not to mention the early church, and yet, suspending the historical credulity that you extend to Socrates, you're perfectly happy to dismiss all this as legend.
We're not talking about the historical existence of Jesus, which I think is a very low probability. I don't think any critical scholars would make it zero, but they would make it such a low probability that it's more likely that he didn't exist than he did. But we're talking about the resurrection stories. If you take the resurrection stories, those 5 accounts of the resurrection, 5 plus little fragments, those stories themselves are the worst example you could possibly give to establish a historical legend. They are internally contradictory. They fall over each other's face. They show evidence of legendary embellishment as the time passes. The earliest resurrection account was from Mark. Well, Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 15, that little thing about the appearances. But then 25 years or 15 years later, then Mark writes a very simple story. If you look at Paul's story and Mark's story, there's hardly any fantastic parts to it. But when you go later to Matthew, 15, 20 years later, and then to Luke, maybe 5 years later, and then to John, you see this growth in the telling of the story, just like happens today when people... There may have been a kernel of truth to it. There may have been a man named Jesus. There were a lot of self-proclaimed messiahs in the first century. There might have been a Yeshua. There was a Theodos the Christ. There was an Egyptian Jew Messiah. There was a Judas the Christ.
So let's get this clear. You're saying that the resurrection stories might have been made up about a guy who never existed.
Well, he may or may not have existed, but it doesn't matter. There was a belief.
Why would you make up a story that a guy who never existed was resurrected?
Well, then it happened all the time. It happened in all sorts of Roman mythology, Greek mythology, and Persian mythology. It happened all the time with these non-existent persons, these god-men who came down, who had these lives, very similar lives, only 1 or 2 childhood stories, nothing much about their life. He follows the pattern. The pattern of the life of Jesus pretty much follows the pattern, the template, let's say, of what a god should be like.
So the Jews who said that the tomb was empty were complicit with the apostles in lying about a guy who was not even alive, and they never actually put him to death, but they were just claiming that they couldn't find his body.
But that story itself is part of the legend. That's not history. That story
That's
itself.
part of the legend. We find that in Josephus. We find it in Jewish sources.
You don't find that in Josephus.
We find in Jewish polemic for 200 years against Christianity emphasizes.
Do you find the story of the tomb in Josephus?
I hesitate on that, so I'm taking that back. But I do know it is part of early Jewish literature against Christianity. I mean, there was a polemic going on between the early Christians and the Jews, in which the Christians were proclaiming the resurrected Christ in Jerusalem shortly after the alleged event. Now, think about this. If Jesus had been killed and never resurrected, the Jews and the Romans could easily have said, guys, this is all very interesting, but here is the body. Case closed.
No.
The reason that they couldn't do that is they didn't have the body.
Jesus was proclaimed on the day of Pentecost, which was, 50 days later, 49 days later. And by that time, in that part of the country, what happens to a body in a grave in that temperature, right? Even if somebody had known where the grave was, even if somebody had brought them, which of those disciples now believing in the resurrected Jesus, which might have happened, there might have been some early Christians who thought their Savior had been. The most plausible hypothesis is that Peter, being so distraught at what happened at the death of his Savior, said that he prayed and he talked to Jesus, and Jesus